Hello, everybody. This is Lynn Domino, coming to you from Northern Michigan University and hosting Let's Talk Books at NMU. Northern Michigan University is located on the sacred homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. Today, I'm welcoming Tom Taylor, speaking on his book, Modern Travel in World History, published by Routledge in 2022. Today's presentation is the final one in this year's series. You will notice at the bottom of your screen or somewhere else on your screen, the icons for the chat and the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk with one another. If you'd like to post a question for our speaker, use the Q&A. I'll monitor that throughout the presentation and then raise the questions at the end. This episode will be recorded and posted soon on YouTube. You can also find previous episodes there. Simply search Let's Talk Books at NMU. Before we get started, I want to give a big thanks to Matt Herbig from Audiovisual Services here at NMU, who is helping with the technical end of this series, and to Dr. Rob Wynn, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who is supporting us financially. Now I'd like to introduce Tom Taylor. Dr. Taylor is an associate professor of history at Seattle University. His work has been published in World History Connected, Journal of Global History, and other periodicals. He recently taught at Semester at Sea, and he has traveled in 10 countries in Asia and Africa. So, Dr. Taylor, welcome to Let's Talk Books at NMU.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, so actually it's 50 countries that I've been to now. And it's not like I was ripping around recently, but it's sort of yeah, I mean, one of the, as I say in the intro of my book, having grown up in Minnesota, I didn't think I'd get anywhere but Wisconsin and Iowa. So to become much more of a global traveler and now to be writing about travel and world history is something that is interesting from a personal level. So thank you very, very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I was thinking as I was just sort of preparing for this talk of my younger days that I got up to the Upper Peninsula on a number of occasions. I don't even know if it's still going. The Pavo Nurmi Marathon I ran as a relatively young person in Ironwood and used to go camping up there. Yeah, what I'd like to do is to give maybe just a brief introduction to about sort of how I came to this project and sort of the background for it, a little bit on sort of the meta themes, and then I'm going to walk relatively quickly sort of through the chapters. And when I do that, let's sort of really try to explain everything that's in there rather than trying to, hopefully, for those of you that are interested in asking more detailed questions about specific parts of it or whatever the case would be. So that's kind of the goal. You know, when I started in graduate school, which was a bit of time ago at the University of Minnesota by training, I'm a 20th century German historian. So in some ways, this book represents my own sort of journey from that area of specialty into world history. And it really came about when I came to Seattle University in 1987. We were a small department. We were a department in transition, excuse me. And in part that meant that as, quite honestly, people were retiring, all of a sudden they said, well, we need you to teach this course and this course. And among other things, I wound up teaching Pacific Northwest history for a few years, which the point of that story was it really wasn't a burden. It was really, for me, an opportunity. And as that went on, I really began to appreciate that as good as and comparative as I thought my graduate work was, there was all parts of the world that I hadn't yet had a chance to sort of think about and to begin to sort of understand. That took a next step when I became chair and we began to rethink our curriculum. And like many departments, we used to be structured our foundational course around Western Civ and modern Western Civ. I knew we needed to move toward world history. And the challenge for me was from the beginning, how to think about teaching world history. It's overwhelming. Many of us do that, right? We have to deal with these Asia, Europe, China, these kind of things. How do we make it understandable? How do we make it comprehensible? But more important for me, it was as a social historian, how do I bring the humanity of world history to my teaching and to my work? As a social historian in Germany, the word is Alltagsgeschichte, the history of everyday life. And I was trying to figure out how to convey that. And the other thing that I've always been interested in history is the teaching the discipline of history, right? I mean, the foundation of history, and Lynn, I know you're in the English department, right, is in stories, but it's stories grounded in methodology. It's stories grounded in historical records, et cetera. And so the short version of that in some ways, and it wasn't a short version, it was really an evolution of my discipline over a number of years as I thought about teaching world history and the discipline of world history. Travelers became that entree for me. Travelers allowed me to begin to think about cross-cultural connections, which are absolutely essential to think about in world history. The stories of travelers themselves open windows into where they were from, what they encountered when they went there, and how they wrote and thought about those places, right? And so that part of it also opened up the idea for me of really beginning to think about the teaching of methodology. How were they writing their stories, or how were they recording this? Who was what was their position on these kind of things? And so travel, it also allowed me, as I began to think about teaching world history, again, to sort of bring the individual and the human into the story, right? Their experiences. We often think about places we go to very much through the very physical nature of the travel that we do, right? And the weather and the food and those kind of things. It allowed me to think about travel from that kind of holistic standpoint, if you will. As an historian, I would consider myself part of what's called the Annals School, which is a school that tries to, as they talk about total history, integrating geography, longer developments in economics and social change, and then the stories of sort of what they would call event history or more everyday life. And travel for me became a way to do that in a window that allowed me to both sort of bring these people alive as individuals, and as well as to get us to think about how we as historians address them. So that was kind of the longer sort of peregrination for this. And over the last 20 or 25 years, I have been working significantly in a variety of ways about stories of travelers, et cetera. And this book is a culmination of that. Let me find it here and I can share quick. Yeah, the book itself is organized around three central themes. It's part of a series by Routledge on themes in world history. It's a series that now has been around quite a long time. My modern travel in world history grew out sort of what I would call the prequel, pre-modern travel in world history. I'll talk a little bit about chronology of that and what I mean by the modern. But the whole point of the series is to be accessible in some ways for works, both financially. This had sort of been a longer term textbook project that because of the nature of textbooks didn't come to fruition. And in part because textbooks are incredibly expensive, right? And there's lots of debates about whether we should do that. The point of Routledge is to have books that are relatively short and then financially affordable so that they can be used in the classroom. So there were lots of interesting challenges to try to figure out how to tell the history of the modern world through travel in essentially 80,000 words or less, which was a fun writing project. The three themes that I focus on are the technology of travel. what kinds of modes of transportation existed. How did they shape where people went, the kinds of encounters they had, and how did that change over time? And I'll come back to that a little bit. You know, I'm not only interested in the technology of travel. I think travel can be a very useful thing to get us to think about technological innovation and what that means in terms of connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. It's also how people thought of that technology, right? And so it's sort of the cultural and social implications of thinking about how and why we traveled in different ways and what that meant. And I can sort of come back to that. So these four pictures, essentially the story of the modern world starts in the 1400s. The sort of ship you see is the image of the Chinese treasure fleet from the early 1400s. Then there's sort of, moves to the railway, the auto, and the plane, and actually finishes up with a brief look, and maybe I can come back to it on, as it just blew up yesterday, the future of maybe space travel, right? Or at least sort of whimsically begins to think about that. But the technology of travel is one theme. The mass movement of people. So travel is not simply about individuals, although that's part of the narrative. It really is about the mass movements of peoples and how and why we as humans have been on the move ever since we've been around. So, as these pictures try to indicate a little bit, I'll come back to it, the Atlantic slave trade and thinking about the magnitude of that, et cetera, et cetera. Migration in the 19th century is sort of symbolized by the Homestead Act. And actually the picture in the right is a picture I took on Semester at Sea in the fall of a small boat that had actually made its way across the Mediterranean as I was off the coast of Spain, and likely refugees from Algeria. But you can sort of think of the issues of modern refugees and migration in the world today. And I had a very, very close-up sort of look at that in October. So the second theme then is the mass movements of people. The third theme, or the third sort of organizing principle, is the experiences and insights of individual travelers. And there I would try to look for a wide range of travelers. As a social historian, I'm interested in, if you will, the well-known, but also the not so well-known, right? I think history is all of our stories. Here, I would sort of say that the driving principle for me is what is called global microhistory. And if it's a term anybody's familiar with, an historian, Tony Andrade, sort of coined the phrase. But it really is this idea of how do we bring complex stories of humanity to a point that's accessible to people. And the idea of global microhistory is to use individuals to tell larger themes and try to bring their individual stories, to try to bring them alive, but then to use that in a way that helps us really understand broader issues of cross-cultural contact, politics, economics, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll give a few examples of those. As I said, let me relatively quickly try to work through sort of the structure of the book, and then again, can be wide open for thinking about sort of a larger conversation on this. As I said, the book starts in the 1400s. So the initial sort of, when I won't try to walk into that, is really how would we define the modern world? And there's lots of things within the academy that would have a wide variety of issues. There was a practical thing for me in that the pre-modern travel and world history book sort of stopped in right around 1400. And my job as a writer was to sort of continue that narrative. But it was also, for better or for worse, in which I tried to sort of symbolize in the book on the right with Columbus, discovery, invasion, encounter, the bridging of the Atlantic world changed the world fundamentally, and remade connections and brought the world together in a variety of ways that really did sort of usher in certainly a new era of globalization, et cetera. the picture on the left, which I sort of use as kind of thinking about the Columbian exchange, because I don't want to simply have it be Columbus as the great explorer. I don't want to have it to be as some sort of argument about sort of inevitable, if you will, Western sort of, movement. It's the story of the Chinese treasure fleets from the early 1400s that sailed across the South China Seas and across the Indian Ocean. The picture, which you can't see great, is sort of a picture of one of Columbus's ship and the Spanish junk, or excuse me, the Chinese junk. And the point of the story is the Chinese certainly had the technology for and did transoceanic travel. But yet, in some ways, the story of the treasure fleet actually got lost in history. And so part of the story of technology, and in some ways the story of the modern world, is the story of decisions about how to use that technology. And that got us into issues around the politics, the culture in China, et cetera, et cetera. And so the simple story of the Chinese treasure fleets is they sailed throughout this South China and Indian Ocean world for 30 years. The fleets came home, the fleets were destroyed, the records were burned, and in many ways, the story of the Chinese treasure fleet was lost to history. That in some ways then also opened the door for Columbus and what would happen later on. I've had a chance to visit the Museum of the Chinese Treasure Fleet, which is an interesting story in and of itself. I'd be happy to share later on down the road. So I argue anyway that the modern world really, we can think about it beginning with the bridging of the Atlantic world, the Columbian exchange, and all that meant at many, many levels. Then I look at a chapter on the Jesuits. Seattle U is a Jesuit university, but it's not simply a sort of a shout out to my institution. The Jesuits as a religious order founded in the early 1540s did truly become, as one historian argued, probably the most important institution in the early modern world because of the places they traveled, and literally they traveled almost everywhere around the globe as in their missionary endeavors, but also because of the ways that they wrote and recorded about those experiences and ultimately interacted in this cross-cultural way. For me, the chapter also allows me to talk about the particular viewpoint of male European religious figures and what they saw, how they recorded things, et cetera, et cetera. This picture is just a picture of the first Jesuit or major missionary, Francis Xavier, and you can see from the map just the extent of his travels in the 1540s. I can also use Xavier to simply talk about what it took to get to places. It literally took him over a year to get between Lisbon and Goa at that point in time. And we sort of use him as then a window into the changes in travel in the modern world because of technology, et cetera, et cetera. I also tell the story of Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit that went to China. This is a map that's its original is actually at the James Ford Bell Library in Minneapolis. If those of you in Michigan ever get a chance to get there. But Matteo Ricci was a Jesuit that went to China to try to figure out how to convert China to Catholicism. And one of his methodologies was to try to convince the Chinese that there was a much bigger world out there than they had been thinking about and encountering. So probably one of his most famous and one of the most famous sort of, I would argue, intellectual pieces ever produced in the early modern world is his map of the world that he presented to his Chinese friends as a way to try to hopefully convince China that Europe was both connected to China and that, but also that there was a bigger world out there that they hadn't encountered. So you can use the Jesuits anyway in a whole variety of ways. Jesuits were known at one level to be interested in accommodating and understanding other cultures. In other ways, in other places, and I talk about it, they practiced, a missionary policy of eliminating the other culture. And I think that's also important to keep in mind. I then moved to travel to and from the Islamic world and think about sort of the importance of the Islamic world. The picture in the middle of Lady Wortley Montagu, a British woman traveling to the Ottoman Empire. And it tells us as she went with her husband how important Europe saw the Ottoman world in many, many ways at this time. The sort of map on the left is a story of Evelia Çelebi, considered the greatest Ottoman traveler in world history. And I use both of them to show in some ways the power, the extent, the reach, and the influence of the Ottoman world. But then also to think about how as Europeans particularly traveled to the Islamic world, they began to construct identities of that world. And Lady Wortley Montagu was part of that, of the Orient as the place of the harem, right? Of the place of the women in seclusion, et cetera, and how, as Edward Said helps us understand, we think about that in terms of long-term projections of the East and the West. We then sort of began to think about, as a consequence of the Atlantic world, the Atlantic slave trade. And what I try to do in that chapter particularly is to think about the experience of that, what the Atlantic slave trade was like, but also ultimately, as well as an historian, to think about how do we try to understand that experience. 12 to 13 million Africans were forcibly taken out of their homelands, put on ships, and over 400 years forcibly transferred to the Caribbean and the Americas. We know almost nothing about them from the standpoint of their writings, their experiences itself. So in this chapter, I really try to help us think about the issues of the kinds of information we try to draw. So fascinating story, if you've never got a chance to see it, of a ship, the Diligent, which was a French slaver ship. So I try to bring the perspective of the slavers themselves. And it became important because one of the captains on the ship wrote a very extensive diary about the process of going to Africa, buying slaves, and then coming to the Americas. We have very, very few accounts of the slavers themselves. They didn't record their diaries, their ideas, because in some ways they knew there were moral issues in the 1700s around this, but ultimately as well, they didn't want to give away their trade secrets, quote unquote, right? And they wanted to sort of keep their business quiet. The picture in the upper right is a picture of the grave of Venture Smith, a rare account that we have by a slave himself who ultimately came across on the Middle Passage. Out of those 12 to 13 million Africans enslaved, we estimate that we probably have about a dozen diaries or autobiographies that would somehow bring a narrative voice to their experience. And then the final thing I use in that section is sort of the middle one, if you've never had a chance to see it, is the Atlantic slave trade database, if I can say that correctly. This is an amazing collection of roughly 90% of the slave ships that they've been able to collect and organize their logs and their basic ship records. And one of the things I have our students, when I talk about it in this chapter and when I use this to teach, is how do we take these basic logs, numbers of slaves bought, numbers of slaves disembarked, mortality rates in many of the ships, et cetera, and how do we bring, in a sense, a story to those numbers? How do we take those raw numbers and try to understand the experience of what it would have been like to been part and of this thing? So in this chapter, in terms of the mass movements of people, there's a special emphasis on sort of the methodology of thinking about that and how we have to do that. And then I go into thinking about the Enlightenment, the scientific, if you will, and colonial voyages that sort of went hand in hand in the 1600s and 1700s as Europeans began to extend their way out. These both pictures are sort of references to Tahiti and the voyages that into the Pacific. And then I sort of think about those travels in search of this question of the state of nature and the state of the natural man. And ultimately, what many Europeans began to call the noble savage and the implications of that characterization, if you will, of people's in terms of how to think about society, how to think about politics, et cetera, et cetera. In that chapter, I not only talk about the explorers, but then I also talk about fictional travel, because many of those journeys got repackaged in ways like people like Montesquieu and the Persian Letters to become vehicles for social and political critique back in Europe. So the Persian Letters, the story of these two guys from Persia that have to leave Persia, wind up living in Europe, writing back to his wife, but they become a commentary on how the Europeans saw the East, if you will. But they're also, Montesquieu wrote this to be a critique of European monarchy and the problems that he saw in monarchy. So I try to use sort of travel in different places, both sort of travelers themselves and fictional travel, as a way to think about how travel became metaphors for other things. And in this chapter, you could think about Gulliver Swift, right? I mean, Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. There's a French woman, Françoise Genet, that wrote about the letters of an Incan princess who winds up in France, right? These imagined journeys and what they can tell us is part of that. As we move into the 19th century, the second sort of technology theme is the railway. But as I try to capture here, it's not simply trains and where they came and how they were built. It's what people thought this new revolution in transportation was going to mean socially, culturally, right? You have a lot of people talking about, now the trains force a social reorganization because you have to be there when the train's leaving, right? You now have standardization of time, right? You have the creation of that. And as this woman, I have a quote from Mary Carpenter, a British woman in India in the 1860s, the railway became an interesting metaphor for them about colonialism and in some ways the benefits of colonialism and what the railway was going to bring, if you will. And so it can give us an insight into the colonial mentality if we think about this technology as well. As we think about that technology, then there's a lot of interesting things on the development of tourism, Thomas Cook, and the development of the tourist industry at that point in time. You have people like Mark Twain beginning to become in many ways, and I think it's a legitimate argument to say that certainly in his time, he was best known as a travel writer more than as a novelist, right, or his other work. And Twain himself becomes a fascinating insight into the ordinary man traveling abroad in this period in a lot of ways. And then to think about it from the standpoint of the reaction to this travel in Romanticism, both as a literary phenomena and then in terms of the emerging ecological movements of the 19th century. There's also at the end of the chapter, and it's sort of my interest, but it's actually a fascinating story. In the 1880s, the first guy to ride a bike around the world, Thomas Stevens. And the New York Times wrote that Thomas Stevens in the 19th century is going to be more important than any philosopher living in Europe at the time, right? And so I think about the bike, the social implications of the bike. As the bicycle emerged as a vehicle of transportation, some thought it was going to destroy gender relationships because now women could hop on a bike and go wherever they wanted to. And, there were all these kind of things. Women no longer were wearing big hoop skirts because they now had to, sit astride a bike. So I think about the bicycle in some ways as part of this revolution of transportation and what it meant in terms of social and cultural issues at that point in time. And then finally, we sort of think about science fiction, Jules Verne, right? Most people didn't travel in the 19th century, but Jules Verne took people to many places, and how fictional travel became part of an understanding of where we were going, right? And what it meant is something that I explore in that chapter as well. And I know I want to make sure I give us time, right? The 19th century is a story of the push and pulls of migration, as I said before, and interested in the Irish potato famine, the Homestead Acts, the migrations where people came, why they moved, what this tells us about social and political change, and also what it tells us about issues of inclusion and exclusion and national identity and those kinds of issues. So, you know, migration opened the doors to fundamental issues as nation states were being formed about, you know, who was part of this new polity, et cetera, right? And this was not only in the United States and Canada. Australia passed anti-Chinese acts essentially at the end of the 19th century, et cetera. And we can also then think of the travels of political reformers. Diego Sarmiento, who became the president of Argentina, was forced into exile in the United States because he wrote a book that angered one of the dictators in Argentina and sort of had to go on a basically escape for a few years. He came to the United States and investigated American education, the American political system, and wound up coming back to Argentina and becoming its second president. And in many ways, it talks about sort of the cultural exchange of ideas on reform in the 19th century. Two other key examples of that from East Asia would be Fukuzawa Yuichi in Japan, a low-level samurai that, as the Americans forced open relationships with Japan, wound up coming to the United States. And his diary of that time is a fascinating look into this sort of cross-cultural exchange. But Fukuzawa himself then became very influential to say, this is where Japan should go based on my understandings of what's happening in Japan. And I won't try to explain it here, but his later life, it also reflects a lot of other issues about emerging colonialism and nationalism in Japan. And then another story in East Asia is the story of Sun Yat-sen, a young man growing up in southern China, winds up going to Hawaii because his brother had been an indentured servant in Hawaii and became one of the richest landowners in China, in Hawaii. And Sun Yat-sen becomes educated as a doctor and uses his understanding of the West and the East as a way to try to think about where China should go in its political reforms in the late 19th and 20th century. And then the last part of the book focuses on the 20th century, the development of the car, its radical sort of implications, but also the car as a cultural and social phenomenon, how it led to the development of suburbs, the implications of suburbs in terms of, certainly, you know, in the United States, in terms of racial separation, right? And the separation of the suburb from the urban and some of the implications of that. So it's the car as a vehicle of transportation, how it changed simply the ways we move about, but it also changed, as we all know, fundamentally, the very sort of physical structures of the world that we live in. And then to think about that from a global perspective as well. As we move through the 20th century, I then think about World War I and World War I as a global war. You know, that old idea that, you know, when did it become a world war? You know, was often the idea when the United States decided to enter the war, right? But one of the things as a 20th century historian that certainly I realized and appreciated the more I've done this, is that World War I was, while significantly, if you will, a European conflict at one level, truly was a world war in which, as it developed, colonies played a central part. So the picture on the left is, or my left anyway, is a picture of Indian soldiers. And there's wonderful sort of letters that were confiscated by the British that give us insights into how are they thinking about this from the perspective of their own reality, but also from the perspective in some ways of larger relationships between the British Empire and India at this crucial time. The picture on the right, that during the course of the war, well over 100,000 Chinese laborers were shipped into Europe to fulfill the labor needs when Europeans were fighting at the front. It tells us something about China at that period of time. China was willing to do this because this new Chinese government that Sun Yat-sen was no longer president of, but had been part of, was hoping to get recognition and support from the outside world. So they were hoping to become part of this story. When those Chinese laborers came to Europe, the US still would not allow them to come through the US because of their discriminatory policies. So they actually shipped them across the Pacific, put them on trains, sealed trains in Vancouver, and shipped them across to Nova Scotia and then to Europe. So we can think about this in terms of what were the expectations about this war for different parts of the world, but then how it sort of reflected these colonial and other issues that have sort of been thought about in earlier places as well. Thinking about the 20th century, I then tell the story of Jan Kozlowski. I won't do much of that here, but it's a story no one's heard about. He was my wife's grandfather, who wound up growing up during Russia right before the revolution. And his story became a story of experiencing the revolution, seeing his brother shot by the Bolsheviks for refusing to join the Red Army. And then Jan, as I try to capture in his story, fleeing across Siberia to get away from the revolution. He eventually gets to Vladivostok, and in Vladivostok, he encounters US forces and winds up in the United States. I'm really interested in Jan's story, not as a family story, but it's a story of an ordinary person, and how Lori and her family learned about Jan is also something to teach about methodology and thinking about that. And then you can think about the Depression, the global movements of people, migration, the closing off of migration, the movements of peoples in the United States, whether it's talking about the grapes of wrath and Steinbeck's sort of talking about the great dust storms, or the story of the hobos and the fleeing and movements, how economic changes sort of compelled dramatic changes in terms of the movements of peoples and the experience of peoples is part of that story as well. And then I try to tell the story of the rise of Nazism and fascism through the people's car, the Volkswagen, both about sort of as the Nazis tried to create a popular, if you will, domestic program. The Volkswagen became a key sort of symbol of that, right? It was going to be sort of Henry IV's version of a chicken every pot. Everybody was going to have a car. Everybody was going to get back to enjoying the good life. Nazism was not about, and so I sort of work with these metaphors, right? Not about the oppression or whatever, but it was about recreating a sense of the good life during the chaos of the Depression. I then sort of carry the story of the people's car to a Jewish man, Victor Klemperer, who was a professor in Europe or in Germany, stripped of his job when the Nazis came to power. He buys a car in the midst of the growing oppression against the Jews in the hopes that the car will give him some sense of freedom and autonomy. And then there's a dramatic story of when that car is taken away from him and what it portends about the sort of coming. And then the final thing I talk about with the people's car, if you will, is that even as the Nazis promised that this was going to be an instrument of liberation, the factories that built those cars, very few actually rolled ever off the lines. They were almost immediately turned into weapons of war, tanks, jeeps, right? And so the story of the people's car, if you will, can be a larger story about Nazism, fascism, and its sort of social goals, if you will, but then ultimately its sort of larger trajectory. And then the last three sort of parts of this are the end of the 40s. As you can see, you try to do a lot in a relatively short period of time in this book. I use the Beatles to think about the youth movements, the culture wars, and as you can see, sort of their own sort of growing sense of going, as George said, from moppy-haired, sort of guitar strummers to people that had to take the politics of the age seriously, right? And so I talk about their personal evolution, which winds up right before they disbanded in India in 1967. And then also someone like Che on the right as a symbol of sort of the Cold War and his travels and what it tells us about sort of the global identities and conflicts of communism at the time. And then finally, two more slides, I promise, or maybe there's three there. We'll sneak it in. When I get to the post-Cold War world, I decided to include this picture because I had a great editor, Peter Stearns, helping me with this book. But when he read the chapter on the post-Cold War, he said, "Why are you including Nelson Mandela? He didn't go anywhere." And I said, "Well, the title of his book is The Long Walk Till Freedom. And to me, travel is about where we move physically, but travel is about a journey, right? And the story that Mandela tells in The Long Walk to Freedom is in part his walk into the prison system of South Africa and then out, but it's more about his transformation from someone accepting violence as a necessary means to address the evils of apartheid, to his understanding that the jailers himself that he's dealing with in some ways are also victims of apartheid, to ultimately his freedom and independence, and then his role as the president. So I use Mandela because I think he's an incredibly important figure, but he also helps us understand that travel in some ways is that personal sort of movement, not just simply the physical movement, if you will, of something. And then it finishes and ends with a look at global migration today. It's got a little bit on the labor issue in Qatar. If you followed the World Cup, I'm a big soccer fan, and the issues around global labor and those kind of things. And then contemporary issues around refugees, right? In the 1990s, we all thought the world was going to sort of get better. World refugees, we know from climate, from political dislocation. I tell the story of this guy and his family fleeing Syria, and basically it took him a couple years to get out of Syria, and then it took his family almost 6 years before they could ultimately be reunited with him. And the stories and perils of migration is part of that. And then it sort of ends with how global travel may be changing with COVID. And sort of thinking of that, okay? I'm going to turn it over to Q&A, but I just want, if anybody's interested in actually getting the book, there's a discount. So if you sort of go to Rutledge and look it up, if you just use this code EFL01, they promised me through the end of June, the people that use that should be able to get a discount. So if you're interested in the book from that perspective, get it as cheap as you can. But with that, I will sort of stop, and I'm happy to talk about any aspects of this that people want me to dive into.
Okay, thank you. This was so interesting. So anyone listening in, if you'd like to post a question in the Q&A, you can certainly do that, and I'll monitor that. Meanwhile, I have a couple.
Sure.
One of the impressive things about this book is how sweeping it is, both in space and in time, right? And to have to learn deeply all these different topics was really striking to me. So early
It
in
was
your talk, you
pleasurable to me,
mentioned-
actually, at the end of the day. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, but it has been, it was a significant intellectual shift, but one I was very happy I took. But anyway, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, yeah. I mean, early in your talk, you mentioned a story about the museum visiting the Museum of the Chinese Treasure Fleet, and you said that was an interesting story in itself. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. So and again, I don't know how many people sort of know this story, but basically the story of the Chinese Treasure Fleet was this massive fleet, 20 to 30,000 people in the voyages, and there were 7 voyages that took place in the early 1400s over roughly a 30-year period of time. That make us simply dwarf our understanding of the technology of Columbus, right? And the Nina, Pinta, and the Santa Maria. But the fleet sailed across South China Seas through into the Arabian world, as far as East Africa. One of the voyages brought back a giraffe that sat in the Forbidden City in China for a number of years. And then in the 1430s, the admiral of the fleet, who himself is a fascinating guy, Qin Hu, had died. A new emperor had come in, and the new emperor wanted to refocus his his government. The fleet itself, in some ways, was controversial because many of the bureaucrats who were trained in Confucian ideas didn't like the ideas of oceanic travel, et cetera, et cetera. And there was increasing sort of issues in the north of China. And so basically the emperor in 1433 orders the fleet home to Nanjing. He moves the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, which, and begins to focus on the Great Wall, but he orders the fleet destroyed. So the fleet is not simply brought home to port, he orders the fleet destroyed, and he orders the records of the fleet burned. And literally, there's almost nothing known about this fleet for roughly 500-600 years. In the late 70s or early 80s, I think, as China's opening up, Nanjing is expanding, and they began to build basically apartments in estuary, and they began to uncover these massive timbers. And everybody's like, well, what are these things and where did they go? The point is they began to rediscover the treasure fleet, but in 2005, on the 500th anniversary, 600th anniversary of the fleet, the Chinese government supports the building of this museum. And so you've got a replica of the ship there. But it's also interesting to me because it's at a time in which China is beginning to reassert its ideas as being a global power, right? And it wants to sort of project that what the Chinese treasure fleet told us was that we had always been part of the broader world. And in a sense, we were going back. One quick story on that just to finish it up. So if you go there, it's a fascinating look not only at the fleet itself, but what it's telling us about China's sort of position in the 21st century. In 2012, I think it was, I was in Beijing. And so part of that trip I went to, there's a Jesuit center there. And Seattle U was interested in maybe setting up a relationship with it. So I was touring it and getting a tour, all that kind of stuff. In the middle of the tour anyway, the Jesuit priest that was leading that said, look, I got to take a break because a bunch of guys showed up in suits. And so he was gone a half hour or so. He came back. He said, what they were interested in were Jesuit maps, which takes me back to Matteo Ricci from the 1500s and 1600s. And what they were hoping to prove is that China had always considered the South China Seas part of the Chinese sort of world. And so anyway, the treasure fleet, as well as that, tells me a story not only of the past China, but where China sees itself today and where it's sort of going. The museum piece itself is not in the book simply because I didn't have the time and space to do it. But it's a fascinating museum about where China is in the modern world, as well as what it tells us about what could have been, if you will, in the early 1400s.
Yeah. Well, given how much you do cover, were there other things that you wish you could have covered in this book?
Oh yeah, I mean, as I said, so let me put it this way. So this had been, or at least an iteration of this project had been, I conceptualized as a comprehensive world history textbook. So at one point, while it was I was a single author beginning to end, told around travel, I had a 1,500-page manuscript that, for the reasons of textbooks in the modern world that were, I think, all, cost and sort of are humanities textbooks worth it, and, open source, whatever, the publisher, and it was the biggest out there, basically gave up on the project. So, what I have for Routledge now, I'm very happy with, but it is a much more concise sort of version of that. And one of the interesting challenges from a writer's standpoint was, how do I take some of these stories and condense them into something that I can sort of carry forth? I'm constantly aware of the fact that, when I picked, for example, political travelers in the 19th century, right? I mean, I look at Simon Bolivar and Diego Sarmiento and a couple other, Fukuzawa, et cetera. There's literally dozens of others, right? I'm always interested in expanding the voices. So in certain places, it's challenging to find women that you can sort of bring into this narrative. And so, but I wish there was more on African travelers in some ways. And I wish there was more on the Islamic world. I mean, I sort of think about it. There's a section on the Hajj. But yeah, I guess, you know, at the end of the day, I tried to be as broad. I'm interested, as I said, in not only the famous, but sort of the common. That's really, really important for me from my goals as a teacher. So yeah, I mean, I could probably write this book and sort of use it as a completely different set of characters as well. But I was also, I'd just say the final thing, you know, that I was really interested, not just simply sort of traditional travel to look at traditional travelers, right? You know, I mean, you know, Henry Stanley's in there, right? But, you know, there's more to the world than these sort of explorers, quote unquote, which is why I was interested in fictional travel and other things that sort of brought it into the area of both social and cultural history. Yeah.
Good. Well, Julie Codell here simply says, thanks for this excellent presentation. So comment, but
Thank you.
Not a question. Yeah. So you mentioned you referred to, at least I think, the rocket from yesterday, but do you have any predictions about how international relations or anything else is going to affect travel in the next 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the good thing about being an historian is I don't open the window right in it too much, right? But you know, I would say, for example, I mean, in the last chapter, in thinking about COVID, right? The story of COVID is a story that in some ways obviously is shaping global travel. But, you know, when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, or we talk about the end of World War I and the Spanish flu, we know that the movements of peoples have all kinds of, peoples carry cultural baggage, right? Intellectual baggage, and we literally carry germs and flora and fauna. So, you know, I mean, global travel, something like that's going to be part of it, right? I mean, I do think, you know, I think there will be an inevitable, at least within an elite. And if we think of tourism in the 19th century, one of the stories is it went from significantly an elite, right, doing the grand tour of Europe, to something that more common people could afford. You know, I mean, I think space will be that place. What it means, I don't know. We'll wait and see. Maybe if this ever comes to a second edition, maybe I'll have to speculate it on a little more, right? But yeah, you know, and then again, to think about it from the technology standpoint, right? And then it's fun to go back to Jules Verne, right? And you know, because the whole point of Jules Verne is that the technology will come, but can humans use the technology wisely, right? Essentially, the story of science fiction is, will technology use us, or will we use technology? And I think that debate will continue.
Yeah. I mean, with this kind of space tourism, it's hard to imagine the technology that would be required for any kind of popular use of that. But it's also very hard for me to imagine myself and most people being willing to be cooped up in the a device as small as a rocket for the amount of time it would take you to get anywhere. So yeah.
But it does raise, when I talk about the Cold War, I do at least look at the space race quickly, right? And Sputnik, and you know, and from Sputnik essentially to the moon landing, and how that shaped, you know, how the technology there began to shape, you know, the Cold War and all those kind of things. So whether it will become common, it will could likely still be impactful in terms of how we think of, to your point, geopolitics, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions, so I do want to really thank you. This has been really interesting for me, and I hope some of our listeners and people who watch this later on YouTube will be inspired to take a look at your book in more depth. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Get out and travel. Good.
And yes.
I appreciate it very much. I enjoyed it a lot, so thank you for having me.
Okay. All right. Goodbye.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.